Justin, thank you for coming today. And first of all, I'd like to introduce briefly Justin Jesty here. Dr. Justin Jesty is Associate Professor of Japanese at the University of Washington, where he researches the relation between art and social movement in post-war Japan. He published a book, Art and Engagement in Early Post-War Japan, from Cornell University Press in 2018. And he is currently researching contemporary socially engaged art in Japan. In 2017, he edited a two-part special issue on topic in the journal Field, a journal of socially engaged art criticism. So thank you very much for accepting the offer. And Justin is giving a talk on the audience and aesthetic, and then we're gonna have a discussion on this presentation and current situation in Japan and in the US. Okay, thank you very much. Can you start it?
Sure, yeah, thank you for inviting me. So I'm happy to have a chance to kind of reach out, have some social contact, even if it's through Zoom. So I appreciate the chance to speak. So I'm going to speak about some of my recent research and talk about one or two of the questions I've been thinking through, and then talk for about 20 minutes, and then hopefully we can discuss at greater length some of the issues or other issues that I haven't touched on. And the theme that I want to organize my comments, my talk around is the question of aesthetics, and particularly aesthetic autonomy, and how that relates to the position or the importance of the audience. And then I'll talk about a couple of places, experiments I got ongoing, endeavors, CS Let's and the Cocoroom, as examples of what I'm trying to communicate in terms of the ideas, the abstract ideas. And starting with the aesthetic does create, I think, a kind of seemingly abstract, distant kind of framing. But I hope that as I talk, it'll become clear that it's quite concrete in its implications. But the starting point is this question of aesthetic autonomy and what it means. Let me see if I can advance my slide here. I think my PowerPoint is... I can do it that way. So the starting point is this question of aesthetic autonomy. And I'm talking about it in the tradition of sort of the people that I've listed here as being some of the main thinkers who have developed this lineage of thinking about aesthetic autonomy. And I think aesthetic autonomy, or the autonomy of art, is a phrase that one hears a lot. But I want to focus on the way that this tradition, Kant, Schiller, Dewey, Rancière, in this tradition, the autonomy is not primarily a question of artworks and artists. It's an argument about the viewer or the audience's relationship to, most generally, the world around them, but particularly towards art objects. So what needs to be autonomous and what needs to be free is the viewer's or the listener's relationship to the event or the object. The feeling of autonomy, the feeling that things aren't given, that there's a gap or a rupture, that there's room for judgment, that you're sort of, I don't know, adrift sort of away from the world of socialized meaning and values of what's familiar, that this is a key aspect of aesthetic experience. So it's a kind of sense of unforeclosed possibilities that involves both the individual, but also their position in the objective or social world. And it's not something that's brought to bear on art objects or artists. So Schiller, for instance, is quite clear that art has an instrumental use. It should be used, it should be deployed to stimulate aesthetic awareness. And the awareness is what needs to be autonomous, not the art object or the maker of the art object. So aesthetic experience can't be subject to cause-effect determination. The artwork or whatever it is that triggers the experience can't determine what the person feels about it, what the audience feels about it. If that were the case, then the relation wouldn't be autonomous, it wouldn't be free. The person's internal state also can't dictate what they're feeling, what they feel. So you can't be driven by needs or appetites. If you're hungry, then you can't have an aesthetic relationship with food because you're driven by your hunger to crave it. And Kant is particularly concerned about distinguishing aesthetic experience from pleasure, from the pleasure of satisfying those kinds of selfish interests. Further, Schiller and Hannah Arendt emphasize that the aesthetic has to be autonomous from the force of rationality, logic, science. Ooh, something happened. Let me start that again. Here we go. So Schiller and Arendt emphasize that the aesthetic also has to be free from the force of logic and science. They sort of are treated as having a force in their argument that's impossible to deny or resist. They kind of drive irresistibly towards a conclusion. So that also robs the listener, the viewer, of their autonomy. It destroys the space for judgment, enjoyment, or even, you know, revulsion. And you can see just this is a Rancière's essay, The Emancipated Spectator, in 2004. It's kind of an important essay. So I don't really want to go through this kind of theoretical background much, but just wanted to point out that just in the very title of this essay, The Emancipated Spectator, you can see the emphasis, that the importance that he's putting on the spectator, on the viewer. So emancipation, autonomy, this is a question that happens or doesn't happen in the viewer's relationship to whatever it is that they're encountering. And in this essay, Rancière proposes these ideas that, like, distance is the normal condition of communication, or words are merely words, and exclude any uniform transmission, any identity of cause and effect. So I just want to highlight this idea that aesthetics is a question of audiences. Any particular artwork might or might not reach the audience. We might think about an artwork having an intended effect. That's kind of a normal thing, but that, you know, in the actual moment of encounter, that might or might not be something awakened in the mind or the senses of the viewer. So it's not possible to predict in advance, but it's the goal, I think, of many artistic practices to reach someone in a way that sort of puts that encounter beyond the usual categories of experience. And so that is kind of the abstract theme that I'm interested in. But I see these ideas playing out very clearly in the practices of places like CS Let's. And CS stands for Creative Support Let's in Hamamatsu, founded by Kubota Midori. The Cocoroom in Osaka is founded by Ueda Kanayo, and I just put the links here in case people want to follow the links and see for themselves. And Harmony is in Tokyo. It's founded by Shinzawa Katsunori. I'm not going to have time to talk much about Harmony in the presentation, but we can talk about that more afterwards if it's interesting. So I'm just going to talk mostly about CS Let's and Cocoroom. And these are basically CS Let's and Harmony are social service providers. The Cocoroom is technically not a social service provider, but their activities kind of intersect with a lot of kind of care and social justice initiatives. Art and care is obviously a huge area of activity. And most care facilities have some kind of arts programming for the clients or the patients. My focus is not on the therapeutic benefits of arts programming. What I'm really interested in is the providers, social service providers that are acting as sites of value transformation. So they develop a philosophy of care that fundamentally affirms the value of their clients' ways of life as they are. In other words, they don't require or impose a regime of rehabilitation that tends towards normalization, but accept the clients where they are as they are. And that project or that approach requires a more general shift in social consciousness around basic questions of value. And that feature of their approach is what I argue makes them sites where non-growth centered or non-productivist life courses and values are being explored. And the mechanism of that exploration is fundamentally aesthetic. It puts the viewer or the audience as being the primary site of transformation and acknowledges that the audience, the viewer, might not get the message every time, but that encounter has to be sort of left up to the viewer to a certain extent. So let me talk about CS Let's first. It's located in Hamamatsu City in Shizuoka, founded by Kubota Midori. Initially, it was just a talking group that she organized for parents of children with disabilities. One of her children was born with developmental disabilities, so she had connections with other parents who also had children with disabilities. But it's grown from there. It now has 2 buildings. And one of the unique features of Let's is that it doesn't impose the rehabilitation goals on the clients. Basically, the clients, the people who use this space, it's a day space, do what they want, and the staff assists them in doing that and encourages them and gives framing to what they're doing. So this is sort of from their website. It's a kind of overall statement of their philosophy. We support whatever the person wants to do, whatever it is they like, whatever they get passionately involved in, even if it's seen as problem behaviors. We aim to create connections between the person and society and build a realm of daily life that does not stop at the facility walls by affirming each person as they are. We discover a role, a job for each person in society based on their individuality as a person with disability, and then put it into practice. So they focus on the individuality of each client, and they actually use the word talent, tarento, instead of client like ryosha or user, it's a more kind of technical term. And they produce kind of playfully imagined profiles that introduce each of the people who use this space. I will call them clients, but they use the term tarento. So, and they have this on their website, kind of list of the people who use the space, and kind of lists them kind of like playing cards, almost like they have special powers and things. And of course their pictures are included if they want to, so that people can sort of get to know them as, or encounter them as unique individuals. Now, the kinds of people that CS Let's accepts are people with relatively severe cognitive disabilities. So I gather, I don't know this in much detail, that there's a kind of 6-stage scale for kind of categorizing people's degree of ability or disability. And Let's only accepts people who are on the sort of more severe end of that spectrum. And so some of the people can't write, some can't speak very clearly. So it's not a situation where, for example, you could run a poetry workshop or something, or organize a organize a play, because they don't really kind of respond to that kind of direction. But to give you an example of one of the talent or clients that lets Tsumi Ryoga is a young man who has a well-defined set of daily activities. He spends most of his morning walking back and forth in one area of the space. CS lets us kind of space. As he paces back and forth, he'll occasionally stop and hop up and down and maybe shout. Sometimes he shouts words or phrases. Sometimes it's just sounds, but it's quite loud and sudden. So it's quite surprising if you're near him, suddenly, yell. And at some point in the afternoon, after lunch, he sits down with a stack of paper and starts writing very vigorously. It's kind of scribbling, so a lot of force. It's hiragana, romaji, numbers, but not sentences, just letters, essentially. And he'll do that for a few hours, and then it's time to go home. He also loves taping things to walls, so sometimes he'll get involved in taping things to the walls around the space. And you can kind of see around this picture of Tsumi-san that there's stuff on the walls. So this is kind of, it's allowed that the people who use the space can pretty much do what they want, alter it how they want to, as long as they're not, endangering anyone else. But these activities, so this set of activities aren't random. They might appear, I think, random or unmotivated to sort of an outside, someone who hasn't met him. But he himself is committed to them. They're meaningful somehow. He performs them with real intensity. And if someone tries to make him do something else other than these activities that he wants to do, if someone tries to make him do something else, he'll resist and eventually become violent. And he actually had trouble at prior care facilities that he was in, because what they would try to train him to do some kind of nominally useful activity. Like one facility, they tried to train him to squash aluminum cans for recycling. Just trying to find something that productive that he could do, but he rebelled and had to leave and find another place to go. So this set of activities that he undertakes every day are the scribbling and taping things to walls. These are activities that he's committed to, and they fill pretty much his entire waking life. So how can we approach these activities? They're not labor. They're not compatible with production in the contemporary economic system. They're also not really compelling as art. This is not art brut or outsider art. Nobody's going to buy his paper that he's scribbled on, and his pattern of walking and shouting is not really it doesn't pass as performance. So CS Let's is not interested in trying to present the activities of their clients as treatable as a full-on art object. And they have, again, as part of their philosophy, that their goal is not to sell paintings or performances. We don't think making artworks is a kind of job. People here are definitely making something. They're doing something, but we're not fixated on the idea of a work. Rather, people do what they want to do as a daily activity, and we position that as their work. So people are already doing what they do, and then the work of Let's is to frame or position this in a particular way that encourages, I would argue, encourages appreciation or admiration of the activities of the clients. So there's something fundamentally important about Tsumi's daily activities. What's lacking is an appropriate social form that can value them. They're clearly important to him, even though we have no idea what that reason is. The idea behind Let's is that we as a society, or we meaning society generally, need to take these activities seriously as such. And doing that puts a lot of demands on the viewer. That's a task for the viewer to undertake. It's on society. So the talent's activities are, they're often disruptive or transgressive of social order. And maybe more fundamentally, they're deeply mysterious, so don't really have access to motivation. for most of the people. And where I locate the art in the Let's approach to their clients is in a process of sort of ongoing experiment or experimentation in developing context, the frames for the talents to appear. They appear as themselves in the outside world, but appear both as themselves and as something special. So there's ways you can see this happening. One is the introductions to the talent. But the people who are, actually, I'll go through some other examples. Another is sort of photographs, concentrated periods of programming. Hyogen Miman, or not quite art or not quite expression, is one of these sort of ongoing organizations of different kinds of activity and performance. And the people who are doing this kind of framing work, coming up with sort of titles for different streams of programming, or coming up with the descriptions of the talents on the website, are mostly from theater and arts backgrounds. So I think that is this is actually something that's really important to this model that Let's is sort of developing. They know how to work with activity without reducing it or trying to find its endpoint. They kind of repeatedly frame and reframe the daily activities of the clients. It's an ongoing process. So it's photography is one method, recording it. There's a lot of audio and video recordings that are available, accessible through the website. Decorating the walls of the space with the results of it. Going for walks outside, so that when the clients go out in a group to walk, they can be disruptive in their behavior, but letting that play out as a performance might, rather than trying to sort of corral it and make it, get them out of the way, so to speak, but to let them be themselves in public. Holding recitals, festivals, so inviting people in from the outside. And the talents, they don't really produce concrete works. Their work is a form of behavior. So this additional work of framing it, of maybe narrating it, or adding a certain voice to it, is creative work that I think requires the intervention of artists and creators to really make work. But to give you some I'll skip some examples. But I do, if you want to look, I have some examples from their Facebook page of recordings of some of the performances at the talent show over the summer that I saw. So we can look at some of the performances if you're interested. This is another, in addition to Hyogen Miman, Statan is another sort of episodic, I don't know what we'd call it, like a production format that they use. It's kind of taking the title from, I gather it was a television program called Star no Tanjo or something. It's kind of a performance program where an amateur performs, sings, or does something, and then there's a judging panel that talks about their performance. So there's a lot of shows like that, but basically using that format. And this kind of format is on the one hand, it's quite approachable and you can understand it because there's a lot of TV shows that are based around this kind of format, but also this is really oriented again around the audience. So the performance is kind of given. The question is, what does the audience do with that? And the audience is required to respond verbally and discuss the performance, what it means, how it could be improved, what people liked about it, what was impressive. So the importance is on the critical activity is really something that's carried out by the audience, this kind of judging panel, but it's actually just kind of an audience of people who are interested in the event. So again, it's kind of really putting the spotlight on the audience as being an integral part of the process of value making that I think runs through all of these activities that appear in various forms. And so these aren't in any kind of normal usage of the term art, I think, but the staff work with it as if it was art. They're treating it as if it has aesthetic significance. It's something to be treasured, to be remarked upon, to be appreciated. So it's not a matter of tolerance, but active admiration, like appreciation. And so I think this is a really clear model or endeavor that's trying to invite people to admire what the talento, what their clients are doing, by framing them as potentially valuable, but it leaves the final answer of what the value is fairly open. It's open on the side of the audience. It's an example of art or a performance functioning as a framework, kind of a pretext where different life courses, different ways of being can be recognized. And again, the ultimate intent or the goal, I think, is to be revalued. But again, it's not something that's forced, but something that's just modeled through kind of habits of celebration and curiosity, humor. Moving on to the Cocoroom, this is a slightly different kind of endeavor, but there are some similarities between them. The Cocoroom was founded by a poet and activist, Ueda Kanayo. It's located in Kamagasaki or Nishinari-ku in Osaka. So it's an area that that's famous or known as a place that many day laborers used to live, and now the day laborers are mostly getting older, elderly population. And I want to focus on the idea of hyogen, which is kind of a very common term. It's not an exotic term, but this is a kind of key term that Ueda uses for some of her activities. And a sort of dictionary translation would translate this as expression in English, but I think that hyogen is a deeper concept than expression is in English. There's a lot of different usages of hyogen. Sometimes it's used kind of like art. So if you see hyogen katsudo, it's kind of artistic activity, but it can also just mean expression. The way that Ueda thinks about this term hyogen is a very broad concept. It's like a fundamental aspect of life, of a life process. Not only humans, like sort of animals as well. Organisms can't help but produce hyogen as part of their movement, as part of the movement that's their life. And it's not individually produced, but in sort of call and response with the environment, with other people. And Ueda has developed her practice, her ideas around this kind of broad concept of hyogen. One of her key phrases, her catchphrases for the Cocoroom is "to express is to live." I think that could be reversed also. To live is to express. And so she writes that expression's not an individual capacity. It's something born in interaction with one's surroundings. It's not the responsibility of an individual. So it's there, I think it differs from the English concept of expression, which is bringing something from your inside out. It's externalizing something. But hyogen for Ueda is not a responsibility of the individual if they're unable to express themselves well. It's something that's made together with the people around them. It's easy to forget that people live by interacting with others and that no one is able to live entirely by themselves. I believe that society will never work by simply dismissing difficult people who express themselves poorly from the space of expression. The kind of expression necessary to live cannot be achieved within a logic of exclusion. And here in this quote Ueda's, from Ueda's writing, you can see here also that it's focused squarely on the listener, on the audience. Expression in and of itself is ubiquitous, and in that way it's different from the idea of like creativity. Some people are creative, other people aren't creative. Some people have it, some people don't. But this idea of expression it's ubiquitous, but what's not ubiquitous is sensitivity to expression. There's patterns of appreciating some people's expression and not others, or some kinds of expression and not others. And those are deeply sort of inflected by social, political situations. So kind of like C.S. Letts, Ueda's working to create frameworks or spaces, opportunities for encounters where underappreciated, where expression that hasn't been valued can be valued. And that's something that produces a certain kind of, it produces something like a poem or something like this, but it's also a process that is significant to the individuals involved. So it involves a transformation of the self and their relationship with others. But it needs always to be at least two people. And so Ueda works mostly with people who have lived kind of solitary lives. It's elderly day laborers. Many people are alienated from their families. People who have addiction problems or had addiction problems in the past, or have criminal pasts or mental illness. And she runs different kinds of workshops that have quite a bit of variation, but I guess one core feature of them is that there's always at least two people. It's kind of dyadic relationship. And one person will either provide a story, tell a story, or maybe just sit. And the other person either maybe look at their face and write a kind of portrait poem about by just looking at them, or maybe would listen to the story and then write a poem based on that story. So there's a person who's kind of reporting or just talking about themselves, or a place that they remember, or a person they remember, and the person who's listening, and this person listening forms it into a kind of a poem or a picture of some kind, and then shares it with the other person, and they talk about it. So this process of listening and recreating is sort of a core feature of the workshops. So it's a simple format, and I doubt it's totally unique to Ueda, but she calls it kokoro no tane, or kotane for short. And what kotane makes visible and addresses is this need for an audience. The workshops at their most basic create an environment where the participants' expressions are valued. And kotane centers on verbal expression, but there are a lot of other activities that Ueda opens up as frames for people to exercise their hyogen, and not just exercise their own hyogen, but like exercise their sensitivity to other people's hyogen. So it's creating a context where people's speech and contributions can be admired by others. And this is something that, like, together with this, she has a lot of collaborators around the neighborhood where the Cocoroom is located, and sort of together with her and a group of collaborators and sort of allies around this neighborhood, she sort of involved in all kinds of workshops and classes like calligraphy or astronomy, poetry, gamelan, kamishibai, performance of various kinds. One project they were doing last summer when I visited that I just wanted to mention just at the end was a project of digging a well in the back garden of the Cocoroom. And so they dug a traditional well, like just using shovels, and they used an electric winch and some hand tools, but basically dug, with shovels. And this is just in the backyard of the building that the Cocoroom's located in. And when she's asked, she can provide justifications for why they dug a well, but I think it's important to keep the non-necessity of digging a well foregrounded. It's not something that's needed. It's pretty eccentric. But one of the justifications that she talks about is that digging the well was a project that a lot of the old men who had been day laborers could participate in, and be leaders, be the people who knew how to do things. So a lot of the other workshops are kind of cultured, poetry or performance, opera or something like this. It's a bit cultured. Whereas this kind of project, there's just a lot of shoveling and moving dirt around. And setting up scaffolding and things is something that the people who had a lot of experience on like road crews and construction crews could knew how to do. So it's an idea. Again, the idea is some kind of structured project, a shared project where the old men can show off their skills and their knowledge and have that be valued, have that be recognized. But again, it's part of this larger project that's not needed. None of this is needed, but desired, valued. And in Ueda's thinking, these individual frameworks, these kind of workshops or projects, they're not guaranteed to change. They're not. The idea is not change the world through this, but they might change one person or two. Maybe each one changes one person, or maybe in 10, there one person changes. If that person meets the project at the right time in their lives, then it can affect an important change in the person and their relations with the world. She writes about some Cocoroom regulars that she highlights, and she highlights the unpredictability of change, like people who showed up for 2 years and didn't really change, and then suddenly one day something happened that hit them in the right way, and it was the right time, and that kind of is a turning point. So it's a really unpredictable moment, and again, there's no way to force it, but just provide as many opportunities as possible. And so she just one more quote from Ueda. She writes that the future is not set for that reason. I think we should think carefully about the apertures opening or closing in our usage of words, so as not to shut things and people out. From within the steady accumulation of such efforts, I believe that an autonomous future is possible. That's the hope, I think. It's not like a goal or something you want to become in future, but a modest hope of like knitting together many tiny openings. So the social change envisioned in these kinds of projects are gradual, cumulative, and also unpredictable. It's not an accumulation like you might accumulate, I don't know, a pile of stones. Or so sometimes it's very sort of it's unpredictable. And what's necessary to sustain it is this kind of constant recreation of whimsical generosity that doesn't need to see its effects sort of right there and then, doesn't need to see its effects face to face. And so this is it's basically the end of my talk. But the point of interest, one of the points of interest for me as I've been working through these ideas is that in some ways the contrast, but also the mutual necessity between the theory or concepts behind the work, and then the complication, the complexity that emerges when those ideas are applied. So in some ways, I would say that Kubota and Ueda and Shinzawa ideas are not that complex. The ideas are not that complex, but they're in that sense, they have a sort of formal elegance to them. I think that they can be expressed quite easily in words, but that expressibility does not make them simple, and the complexity comes through in the sort of daily practice of them, which brings out a really huge variety of experiences and ideas from among the people who are kind of participating in them. So that in some ways I see some resonance even with sort of formalist aesthetics, you know, Shklovsky and things. It's kind of can be quite simple, the intervention, but the effects of that intervention, if they hit sort of at the right place and time, can be really generative in really surprising ways. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Justin. It was a wonderful presentation. Well, first of all, thank you very much for kind of reminding me of the importance of audience. I mean, when you talk about the autonomy, we often talk about autonomy of artists or autonomy of artworks in a sort of modernist way, but at the same time, we are not often discussing the autonomy of audience, or how the kind of role of the audience are changing. And this was a really good example, actually. You actually picked up the two examples, but I wanted to listen to more, but because of the time strain, we have only two examples, but it's really a good starting point. The first question is more about relation to our own project. I mean, relation, because we said that this is a project for sort of criticism and a new media platform. The reason is that it's very hard to think of critique at this moment, because critics, particularly art critics, are becoming more invisible in many ways. And from your discussions, the one of the possibility, yes, the audience could be a sort of potentially critics or the project. They evaluate what's happening in the world. But at the same time, there should be another type of critics, but more kind of professional critics. How you can evaluate this activity, from which point and by what kind of standards they have. So I don't know how you think about, but probably these sort of professional critics might have some special skills, or even they should be, amateurish still, even there. I mean, so can you explain me about the sort of, the possibility of critics here, or maybe the audience themselves could be a good critics first?
Yeah, so I think criticism and critique, there's kind of a few different, that term covers a few different kinds of phenomenon or activity, I think. So that, as you mentioned, like, I think audiences are critics themselves in a basic sense, right? There's, audiences respond to certain things and not others, talk about it with friends, share it on social media, what have you. So there is a, people react to what sort of life presents them, and especially something that's heavily framed as sort of a performance. People will have some reaction to it. So there is that. I wouldn't necessarily want to overvalue that, but I would say that I mean, that's something that I think kind of will kind of happen on its own in a way, but I think it's worth noticing that does happen on its own. It's not like people are just sort of seeing something and not doing anything with it. And actually, I was kind of interested in Fukuzumi Ren's project of sort of running art critic sort of workshops, where yeah, and I think that if there's if there's an audience for that kind of criticism, then it grows, right? If somebody is having a conversation with their friend and they have something that they both were thinking about, even if it's from opposite direction, that, you know, the conversation grows. So I think in that case also, if there's a certain kind of structuration of the reception of that sort of everyday kind of everybody does it kind of criticism, then that can develop into something really interesting. So but that's one kind of level.
Yes.
There's also, I think, the kind of the kind of critical. I think it does kind of come into this under the umbrella of criticism, but sort of framing the new, or framing the familiar in new ways. So thinking about the ways, the activity that the staff of Let's is engaged with in spying the sort of the flash moments where they can see something that they want to communicate about the activities of the clients, the talent in Let's. So that the ability to sort of find value in unusual places or in unusual ways and communicate that in some way, or make it accessible to other people, that also is a form of critical activity that's that requires a certain awareness of the world that's not relying on explanatory, you know, available explanations. There always I'm sure that you could come up with some explanation that made, to me, activities seem, I don't know, that the logic, you know, there's an explanation for everything if you want to find it, right? But not going to those the available explanations, but trying to find something new, or finding a new way of looking at things that you think you already know. I think that kind of generative sort of searching for and sharing value is part of criticism. And I see that happen, and I see that that's very overlapped with artistic activity, I think. And that's something that I don't see suffering tremendously. But I also do think that as with artistic activity, that kind of activity is crucial and needs to be supported. But there's another meaning of criticism, which is like actually being critical, right? Like actually being negative about something, right? And that's something that like is has lost its place, I think, in terms of like public books and movies. It's lost its place to the kind of crowd criticism, right? So now, you know, Rotten Tomatoes has taken away, you know, the profession of film critics that used to work at newspapers, right? So there's a way that there's a sort of undermining of that kind of critical criticism that comes, I think, with sort of in the internet, the web. But there's also, I think, a narrowing space for dissent or disagreement about things that many people take to be valuable, or many people are invested in claiming are valuable. So if take any example, like an opera is staged, is, you know, who is entitled to say very negative things about that staging? It would somebody who knows opera well enough that they can say things that are relevant. It's not just somebody being nasty, or someone who doesn't like opera, right? That doesn't have any meaning if someone who doesn't like opera is critical about opera. So, you know, it has to be someone who's really knowledgeable about the form, someone who cares about it, who's willing to, because they're not going to be making themselves popular. They're sacrificing their sociability, their ability to make friends in that world by saying these things. So it's someone who cares about some aspect of the form more than sort of their immediate sort of they're willing to sacrifice the kind of friendliness of their relations with other people. And I think that those both of those are costs. Those are really the education, the willingness to sort of put a tradition or a form above your sort of individual good feelings for other people, is something that's tough. And I think it needs to be supported financially, but also recognized by the community of, say, opera fans and producers and other critics. And that kind of negative criticism, like something's wrong here, I think is what people point to when they talk about, people are pointing to when they talk about there being sort of a lack of criticism of socially engaged art projects. In terms of the things that I introduced today, I would say that part of thinking through this, I've realized that I think that there are evaluative criteria that are faithful to the endeavors, but are also can become standards of critique. So I think, as I was saying, I think that both Kubota and Shinzawa and Ueda have quite concise and sort of really well-developed philosophies underlying what they're doing. And if you have understood that, then you can use that as a criteria and say, okay, well, first, there might be a problem in that logic. There might be a problem in the philosophy that you're claiming to adhere to, or there might be poor applications of that principle in one case or another, things that sort of betray or undermine or don't really get at some of those basic commitments. So I think that there are those situations, they do provide some criteria for legitimate critique. But also I would say that, for artists that are working in the social sphere, there might be a lack of art criticism, but I don't think there's a lack of criticism. People working sort of out in the wild, so to speak, or it's not the wild. I mean, C.S. Letts is a legally established social service agency. They have responsibilities to their clients, to their families, to their employees, and there's they get plenty of criticism from other fukushi shisetsu, right? So I would say, and Ueda's like the Cocoroom as well, as somebody working in that field, there's guaranteed to be other people who are interested, who are passionate about the same social problem, who are doing it differently, and who have differences and criticisms about the way that the Cocoroom or C.S. Letts or Harmony approaches their goals. So I think that the lack of criticism in the art world does not necessarily mean a lack of criticism, but I do think that there's been a difficulty in establishing criteria that seem faithful to the projects being carried out, that can be used as a basis for critiquing them as artworks or performance works. And in the sense that, say, Kubota-san has this idea that she's putting into practice, and we could, it's a bit weird, but talk about C.S. Letts and its clients. It's the institution as a medium. There are certain resistances and affordances in that medium that she's kind of working with, and she's changing as she engages with it. So there is a question of sort of the appearance of her idea in material form, even if that's a social form that involves other people, like a theater production. There's expectations that I think the clarity of the logic can be questioned, the way that it precipitates in terms of material, social relationships among the people. It's So I think that that investigating some of the logics that are being claimed maybe could provide some way to begin to criticize the aesthetic claims, the artistic claims of socially engaged art. But it's taken me a long time just to get to that basic level, and that's with, ventures like Cocoroom and CS Let's, which are sort of, I think, really admirable for their clarity of thought. I think that it's more difficult for things that might be more in the museum space already. So yeah, I think maybe what are your thoughts? I think that there's, yeah.
Yeah, well, basically, I agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of criticism anyway. Not art critique, but they are sort of, they are always facing a severe criticism, and also even they are facing a sort of discrimination against sort of those who are marginalized. So the question is that, maybe the art critiques, criticism from aesthetic perspective could support their activities by sort of protecting, against this kind of criticism, nasty criticism. But in fact, sometimes the art critics simply exclude these activities from art field. Oh, this is just politics. This is just social. Nothing to do with art. This is one of the way of how the art critics deal with these kind of activities. So the question is what, for instance, the art critics can do that. I mean, this not from kind of aesthetic perspective, but from some other perspective. I don't know what kind of perspective they could have, or maybe simply we don't need the art critics anymore.
Right. See, I don't think. Yeah, it's tough. So there's lots of different. Obviously, there's lots of different art worlds.
Of course, and
I
also
think
different art critics too.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, something like really any socially engaged art is, I guess, Theaster Gates. There's some artists who have really bridged the different worlds for sure, but I don't think anything coming out of CS Let's is going to be seen as like an object to be collected. So I think it's really outside of that world of museum collection and collectors collecting things and auctions and whatnot. And that seems like an obvious point to make, I think. But I think when we're reading especially European critics, but also American ones to an extent, art critics, I mean, they're pretty close to that world. It's, even if they kind of have sort of democratic ideas about art, there is, I think, a difficulty in, if you are going to be committed, if you're expecting your criticism to be shaping the money art world, then there's I guess I would say there's sort of a like a code switch. There's like a threshold where that you're on one side or the other to an extent, and if you're willing to entertain a sort of democratic idea of art, that to an extent everyone is capable of artistic creativity, everyone's way of living has an art to it that can be appreciated. I think that's overstating things a bit, but if you're going to move to sort of that mode of approaching things, I think it's difficult to communicate across that barrier or across that threshold, I feel. And I think that at the end of the day, places like CS Let's or Cocoroom or even to some, well, yeah, that's, I won't add that on, it's gonna complicate things, are really not oriented towards the art market or towards a sort of traditional view of the museum. So I think that in terms of what I would say critics can do in talking about the work of it's kind of socially engaged or sort of care and art type endeavors is to it is to approach them seriously as art, but I think always, if that's going to be read as art criticism, I think there almost always has to be some address to the issue of hierarchy, taste hierarchies, class. I think you have to sort of declare yourself as someone who's approaching this sort of from the side of that doesn't fundamentally recognize sort of a transhistorical legitimacy to hierarchies of that create an art canon, an art that's filled with art objects that have been established, and really you focus more on the process. So I think there is a basic process that they all share, is the question of value. What is valuable enough to share with your friends? What's valuable enough to share with your colleagues? What's valuable enough to put the effort and money into preserving for the next generation? What should we be leaving for grandchildren and whatnot? You know, so those kinds of decisions, those are often not made consciously. It's kind of a really sort of broad social process that ends up with a culture at the end of it. But the basic process of finding things valuable is something that they both share. But at some point, I think that it does have to be some kind of expression of some incompatibility in terms of what the ultimate goal of valuing that expression is. You know, are you trying to create an object that's tradable, or an experience that's tradable? You know, are you trying to market an experience that somebody could pay money to participate in, or something like this, you know? So I think, that some clarity there is necessary, and I do, sense some,
What I was saying is, basically, I like your idea, because you try to actually, there is a movement of for instance, outside art, as now outside art collected and put into museum, organize a sort of exhibition, and actually outside art are making money.
And Japan has a huge market for that.
And yes, this is one of the way of surviving anyway. I mean, sometimes they need money, but at the same time, we have to be careful of, probably there should be another strategy to deal with. Particularly, if you look at CS rates or Cocoroom, it's very difficult, as you said, to put them into market, or so in that case, I really appreciate the approach. At the same time, we know that they have a sort of financial problem all the time. It's very hard for them to raise some sort of fund or enough money to survive. So I don't know what kind of way they can take, or or one of the easiest solutions is that maybe they could rely on the public money, for instance, local authorities, or maybe I'm in a way I'm putting a sort of practical questions. What is the best way, so if they don't rely on the market? Of course, nobody knows. That's why they are facing a crisis all the time. But
and it's interesting in that I would say that both the Cocoroom and CS Let's are relatively successful in. And with Cocoroom, it's interesting. Ueda's really kind of run out of public funding opportunities. She's applied to so many different grants over the years that she's come, there's a limit to them. And most of the income for the Cocoroom is commercial. It's the guest house and cafe as a business. So I think that that's one avenue, is having sort of a business model that runs alongside and maybe intersects with, but is kind of separate from the main, the aesthetic or the artistic kind of activity. And with CS Let's, I think, and kind of with everybody, it's just it's a really scramble to kind of put together as many different kinds of interest and funding as they can. And I honestly don't know what the final answer is to this. Part of me wants to say, better public funding for this kind of thing. So it's kind of governmental alleviation of the kind of administrative stresses, the financial stresses that these kind of things face, and that artists face generally. Another part of me is, I don't know, it's almost like I don't know, primeval or sort of like, I don't know, a law of the jungle kind of, that this kind of activity is something that is to some extent irrepressible. It's something that happens, whether it's being sort of supported or not. It happens, and it happens for all kinds of sort of economic structural reasons, but also because there's people who have sort of built the project, and their sort of energy and creativity and sort of mission have kind of been able to bring things together enough to create a foundation or a structure, and that is sort of always happening at some level. So in some sense, the fact that they've succeeded, it really is very like ends justifies the means, like law of the jungle kind of logic. But the fact that I can go to the Cocoroom, that I know about it at all, that I can go there, that I knew about CS Let's is sort of an expression or a phenomenon that's predicated on their partial success, at least their ability to bring together enough to create this enough momentum to create something that can be visited, that can be looked at. And that, again, I was thinking about sort of in generational terms, once it gets to the scale of something like the Cocoroom or CS Let's, that is creating something that has the capacity to be transgenerational, even though, like, from the perspective of the people who are responsible for it, it's I can only imagine that the stresses and difficulties that are sort of the nuts and bolts of what really is making that machine work. And so I don't know what the answer is. I guess my problem is that I don't have enough knowledge or kind of theoretical apparatus to so. On the one, I can think of it in terms of a policy question of sort of taxation and devoting certain funding to the arts. I can think of it in terms of like producing my own discourse about it. Universities are really important, I think. And as a faculty member, I think that, I want to contribute to their endeavors to the extent that I can, through writing, speaking, and what have you. The other artists, sort of critics as well. What was I talking about? So I kind of lost track for. So I can think about it in terms of those kind of policy or kind of a systematic way. but on the other hand, there's part of me that feels it in that's much more distant in terms of like what creates what is culture, what is civilization, where does society invest its wealth? These kind of really big questions are the ones that I feel that I want to integrate more. So what, you know, where is the value of our collective lives? What is the best of our collective lives? How what should we be investing in that? That kind of question is what appears to me as sort of urgent when I encounter these, because you know, it kind of with post growth situation and sort of low growth economics and sort of the shrinking of population and the question, maybe decentralization and sort of the opposite of the prototypical kind of modern things: centralization, rationalization, aggregation, bigger, better, richer, whatever. So how do we imagine transgenerational meaning without the idea of growth, or like what's so valuable that should be preserved, that should be passed on, that should be appreciated for other people? So I feel that there's kind of that kind of large scale question is one that keeps coming up and bugging me. And I don't have a good way of linking that to policy yet, maybe ever, but
yeah, good. Yeah. Okay. I think we should. Oh, maybe this is final. I mean, last question. Yeah. Probably. We should discuss a sort of the kind of distribution of knowledge or information. Or circulation. Distribution of knowledge or value or whatever. That's the thing is, for instance, art institution like a museum or journal, art critics, they actually a system of sort of distribution of knowledge. Right? So you can show your artworks in a museum, in a gallery, and also the art critics can write about it and publish it through the journals. But at the same time, kind of, the activities are like, Cocoroom or CS are sort of, invisible to kind of majority of society, right? So there should be sort of the, system, how we can make the activity visible, even outside of museum. But in fact, kind of university might be working, kind of sociologists or cultural studies scholars or even the art historian like you, can discuss these kind of activities in the university or in academia. But at the same time, how we can, the question is how we can make these activities more visible to society and more sort of, I think, I don't think the museum can work in that way. Even though, they sometimes invite Cocorooms to exhibit their artworks, but do you have any idea of the sort of distribution network?
So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that I think that the so universities' role is really crucial in this kind of area, in sort of either finding or amplifying the work that's being done that isn't being paid as much attention to. And I would say, like in my case, I hear about something. Everything that I've ever written about is something that I heard about from somewhere, from somebody, right? There's some mediation, right? I didn't just, wake up and like turn over in bed and there it was, So there's always a route that I encounter it through. And for example, like the Turn project, the Tan.
Okay, yeah.
Festa and so that that was a format that allowed me to encounter CS Let's and Harmony. I had known about Cocoroom, and I encountered the Cocoroom through the Art MPO forum meetings.
Oh, yes.
So Ueda spoke at one of them and I met her through one of those. So so those kinds of sort of mutual support networks and projects that, you know, Turn is not about care itself. It's really, it's a format for, I think, maybe doing something like you're saying is sort of increase knowledge, increase awareness within the field of sort of innovative or art related care, but also get attention from outside. That's valuable. And that, I don't know, what can I say, is that once it's encountered in terms of my positionality, I feel that I want to sort of share it and relay it and structure it in a way that people will pay attention to it and want to go see it themselves, but also kind of keep trying to find new things. I feel that that's a sort of responsibility to not, to be aware of that there's so much that, you know, you don't already know. And then I do feel that sort of a luxury of, you know, having a stable salary as a university professor, of not having to sort of write a certain amount of words per week on deadline as like a newspaper reporter might, you know, that is, that's something that I feel is sort of a responsibility that goes along with the position. So I think universities, and to some extent, you know, museums as a research, you know, curators do some research as well. And and I would never sort of discount museums. I mean, especially local museums, are so tremendous repositories of local cultural artifacts and also knowledge. So I think that, I think really comes down to creating formats so that the next person who encounters it for the first time can experience some of the attraction or some of the spark, even if you know there's room for criticism, but that something gets through to the next person. So I mean, like an online sort of this sort of conversation being posted online is one thing, or me or other people sort of writing pieces or sharing photographs of places that they visited, I think is important, but that those shouldn't, those things that we produce, say, or that I produce, should also be really, you know, carefully constructed with the hope, at least, that somebody will encounter them, and that it might be something that sparks sort of a new sort of way of engaging with what it is that you're introducing. So I would say the kind of like, just like have a lot of stuff, sort of just a lot of material and dump, you know, put it up, make it available. That's not very helpful. And that especially, you know, after 20 years of, I don't know, web 2.0, you know, there's just so much information out there that I think all of us, even, you know, me writing, you know, academic papers, we have to be really conscious about the scarcity of really appealing or really enlightening, you know, material. And I think that, you know, quality is something that, you know, I just hope that that means something in terms of the way that people encounter it, but that, you know, structuring and paying attention to the form, the kind of the overall, the goal, the principles, and, you know, maybe not putting everything up that occurs to you, but just really trying to focus on what it is that you think might spark some reaction in the next person who's encountering it. I don't know, it's very like humanist.
Yeah. Yeah. But the thing is that the kind of our project hope to be sort of one of the platform to exchange some idea anyway, to promote, you know, as kind of distribution of the knowledge or information. And I don't know what we can do, but maybe important to discuss, what we can do, and then keep on going. And
and I just on that point, I do think that the weakening of museums is really problematic on that point. And I do feel that, with the undermining of so many institutions like museums or like a kind of local chiho, local newspapers and things, that there are a lot of things that are in danger of just being forgotten and never recognized.
And there used to be a lot of interesting kind of local museums, galleries, which kind of have a good documentation of the kind of, not only the art, but also social, political issues. But now they are also facing a crisis now. So that's maybe we should discuss this in a different,
But it's something maybe to just keep in mind. It's something to keep in mind. I think it's a really important problem, even if it's not solvable, even if there's not a solution per se. It's the part of the solution, I think, is just being aware of it.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it's becoming too long. Time to finish. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.